Good evening, everyone. Special guests, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin the proceedings, though, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people of the Wiradjuri Nation, because it's on their ancestral lands that this amazing building that we're privileged to use is built. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship country. So good evening, everyone, and on behalf of the Australian Academy of Science, a very warm welcome to the Shine Dome on this cold Canberra evening. I'm Suzanne Corey, and I have the privilege of being the president of this academy. Welcome also to all of those who join us online for this event. It's being broadcast live on the internet. Over its 54 years, this building has seen and heard a great many talks and expositions on all manner of scientific issues. Tonight is going to be different. We're going to hear not about any particular area of scientific endeavour, but about the ways in which the nation's research efforts and scientific thinking are translated for broad public digestion, response, and, dare I say it, appeal. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? That's an old philosophical quandary. And the same predicament, though, applies in part, I think, to science. How can the knowledge built through a scientist's work benefit society if no one hears about it? The interface between science and the media is not always a comfortable or easy relationship. Misunderstandings can, and often do, flourish on both sides. But the media plays a central role in connecting people to science. And in Australia, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, has taken the lead in this respect. I'm proud to be able to say that the ABC and the Academy worked together in the mid-1960s to establish the ABC Science Unit. And while newsrooms around the nation have over the past 12 months been stripped of their science specialists, the ABC Science Unit persists, and long may it continue to persist. Tonight, the chair of the ABC, Mr. Jim Spigelman, will discuss the role that science plays in the media, or perhaps, Jim, will it be the role the media plays in science? I think that you all know that Mr. Spigelman has had a rich and varied career. He's been the Chief Justice and Lieutenant Governor of New South Wales, a Senior Advisor and Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister of Australia, and a Permanent Secretary of the Commonwealth Government's Department of the Media. He was awarded the Companion of the Order of Australia for his services to law and the community, in bringing about changes in attitudes to the administration of justice for a more fair and equitable society, and to the support of the visual arts. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Mr. Jim Spigelman.
Thank you, Suzanne. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The successful communication of science requires more than simply expertise, it requires enthusiasm. As many in this audience will recall, in Australian broadcasting history, no one was able to convey such enthusiasm better than Julius Sumner Miller. He made hundreds of episodes of his iconic program, Why Is It So?, for the ABC between 1963 and 1986. However, his first appearance on Australian television in 1963 was not auspicious and serves as a reminder of the need for thorough preparation. He attempted to drive a straw through a raw potato by pinching the end of the straw so that the trapped air acted as a piston. However, for the first time, he could not get it to work, and he exclaimed loud in the broadcast, "Australian straws ain't worth a damn." When he arrived at his Sydney University laboratory the next morning, he found, he said, about 1 million straws on the floor with a telegram saying, "You might find one of these fitting your requirements." As he said later, "I made a mistake. I should have said Australian potatoes ain't worth a damn, and I would have cornered the potato market." My credentials to address a gathering of the Australian Academy of Science are limited. As a barrister, I frequently had to prepare for the cross-examination of scientific expert witnesses. Indeed, my very last case at the bar, before my appointment as Chief Justice of New South Wales, required me to cross-examine Tim Flannery on the habits of the long-nosed bandicoots of Manly. Now, like any good barrister, I emptied my mind of all that superfluous scientific knowledge immediately thereafter. I did, however, spend 3 years working on a science and technology project as co-author of a book on nuclear energy for a New York publisher. This was eventually published in the USA, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Spain, and Japan. Our book, entitled The Nuclear Barons, is a political history of nuclear energy from the Manhattan Project to 3 Mile Island. It took 3 years of full-time research and writing. It was my most intensive exposure to scientific issues. The book starts with a focus on scientists, especially physicists, but eventually, basically, the engineers took over. My involvement in that project led me to seek appointment as president of Sydney's Powerhouse Museum, where I tried to reinforce its focus on science and technology. These experiences are the basis of my strong belief in the fundamental significance of science and technology in our lives. Most of the critical issues we face require the continued advance and application of scientific knowledge. I share the concern for our nation's future, often expressed, including by Ian Chubb, the chief scientist, about the decline in the proportion of students choosing the STEM subjects, sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In stating such propositions before an audience of this kind, I do not have the feeling that I'm taking my life in my hands. However, your reaction may be somewhat different as I consider the role of the media in communicating science, which is the subject of my address today, and specifically the ABC's contribution to the communication of science. Scientists and broadcasters inhabit different intellectual cultures. A working definition of science is advanced by Edward O. Wilson in his very recent work, published only this year, Letters to a Young Scientist. He said, "Science is organised, testable knowledge of the real world. It is the combination of physical and mental operations that have become increasingly the habit of educated people, a culture of illuminations dedicated to the most effective way ever conceived of acquiring factual knowledge." It's the end of the quote. There are no doubt some journalists who indulge in the conceit that this is something that they also do, but it's not. The media does not have a culture of illuminations. Even public broadcasters like the ABC can aspire to no more than a culture of explanations. Nor are journalistic techniques of acquiring factual knowledge comparable to the scientific method. In journalism, peer review is something that usually happens in the pub. The difference in roles, as well as of institutional culture and of language between the two disciplines, goes a long way to explaining the frequently expressed frustration of the scientific community with media reporting. However, you're not alone in this, but that's probably of little comfort. There's never been a time, and I suspect there never will be a time, that scientists have not felt that science and technology does not receive its proper share of broadcast time. However, that is a complaint which science shares with virtually every other sphere of discourse. Similarly, there's never been a time when scientists have not felt that programming is more populous or even more dumbed down than it used to be. Again, you're not alone in embracing the myth of a golden past. I think it's got something to do with getting older. I find myself reacting in that way in different areas of discourse. The ABC has four distinct roles in science communication. First, to provide information to those with a special interest in science, by which I encompass the areas of medicine and the environment. Secondly, to provide information about scientific issues to the general public, both to assist our fellow Australians to make decisions that affect their lives and to enhance their ability to participate in the range of social and political processes with a scientific dimension. Thirdly, to provide opportunities to the scientific community to explain what they do and its significance. The fourth, perhaps least welcome role is to hold scientists and technologists to account for their claims and their conduct. The relationship between scientists and the media cannot be a one-way street. The ABC must provide depth, intelligence and expertise for our science-literate audience. However, we must also provide programming for a broad audience, not least to promote scientific literacy in the general community. Accordingly, many of our programs must be expressed in language that non-scientists understand and in a way that is capable of attracting and holding the attention of multiple audiences. Once one goes beyond our specialist science programming, the difference between scientific and journalistic cultures becomes particularly evident. Scientists are understandably primarily concerned with what the public should know about science. Journalists, other than the specialist science journalists, however, are primarily concerned with what the public wants to know about science. That does not mean that the ABC, unlike commercial broadcasters, has a focus on ratings. As one wit said, look what happened to the battleship Potemkin when the ratings took over. Nevertheless, for a national broadcaster, with a statutory obligation to provide programming of general as well as of specialist appeal, the ability to attract and hold an audience remains a relevant consideration in story selection. There is, however, a fundamental difference between public and commercial broadcasting in this respect. The ABC must relate to the public in their capacity as citizens, not in their capacity as consumers. We must do that in the full range of our conduct, including relevantly the content of programming. The fact that the ABC does not seek to maximise its audiences means that we must go beyond just reporting scare stories and breakthrough stories, many of which are a little better than a parody of science. Furthermore, it's essential that the content of our science stories must treat our audiences with respect as citizens. They must not be dumbed down to be virtually devoid of scientific content. A critical resource in this is the group of individuals who specialise in science journalism. Regrettably, this appears to be a dying breed in most mainstream media, but not, I'm pleased to say, at the ABC. Science journalists like Robin Williams, Norman Swan, the Catalyst team, and Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki, and a number of specialist news reporters combine an understanding of scientific concepts and methods with an ability to explain science clearly and succinctly to lay audiences. The combination of skills is vital if the ABC is to successfully serve the purposes I have listed. Last year I delivered an address on the role of the ABC in Australian culture. I set out the way the ABC uses the arts broadly defined across all its platforms. That came as the scope and depth of that came as a surprise, not only to me, not only to the audience, but to many employees of the ABC. Our participants and audiences tend to focus on the particular programs with which they are involved, without being in a position to appreciate the full range of the ABC's contribution. I think that's true of virtually everything we do, and specifically with respect to science programming. What I want to begin this evening with is to outline in a more or less comprehensive way our contribution in this field. I was pleased, for example, to note the remarks not only of Suzanne Corey this evening, but also one of our distinguished Nobel laureates, Peter Doherty, who said in a recent address that science has, and I quote, a strong presence on the ABC, unquote, and I believe that's true. ABC's science coverage, to adopt the words of Sir David Attenborough about the BBC's coverage, extending a traditional metaphor, he said it stands head, shoulders, thorax and abdomen above that of any other broadcaster. Now, I ask for your patience for a few moments because I understand listening to a list isn't exactly the most engaging experience. The Science Show has been presented by Robin Williams since 1975. I'm first talking about programs on Radio National. It's one of the longest running programs on Australian radio. It has an average weekly audience of 103,000 in the 5 mainland capitals where the surveys are conducted. 2012 had 1.7 million podcast downloads. The Health Report, presented by Dr. Norman Swan, city audience of 98,000, 1.1 million podcast downloads. Occam's Razor, a series of 15-minute talks by guest speakers introduced by Robin Williams, attracted 85,000 average audience in the Metropolitan Survey and 259,000 podcast downloads. All in the Mind, presented by the ABC's Radio Science executive producer Lynn Malcolm, attracted an average weekly audience of 77,000 and had 1.3 million podcast downloads. Radio National also rebroadcast The Naked Scientists from the BBC. There are also 3 science programs on News Radio, Spectrum and Living Planet, science news programs from Deutsche Welle, providing technology and environmental news, respectively. Discovery is a BBC World Service program focusing on discoveries, trends in science. Health Check is another BBC World Service weekly roundup of global health stories. Radio National carries a number of programs that cover science within a broader subject area. Off Track is a weekly program about the Australian environment. Future Tense is a weekly program that examines social cultural change, often scientific change. Body Sphere, weekly program, covers things that humans do with their bodies, including science and technology stories. Furthermore, Bush Telegraph on Radio National and the ABC Rural Broadcast Team throughout the ABC's comprehensive national network of 60 regional stations regularly report stories involving the work of the CSIRO and agricultural scientists. Numerous non-science programs across the radio network have regular science segments and or guests. Triple J's Morning with Zan has Dr. Carl, who's the oldest announcer on Our Youth Music National Network, that Triple J. I suspect he's the oldest announcer on any such station anywhere in the world, but he communicates his love for science to a young audience. He has over 180,000 Twitter followers. In 2012, his segment had an extraordinary 2.8 million podcast downloads, one of the highest for any program. Breakfast with Frank Kelly on Radio National has a specialist environmental reporter, includes a weekly discussion with Dr. Chris Smith of the BBC's Naked Scientists. 702 ABC, almost all presenters have at least one regular science segment. Adam Spencer on Breakfast has a weekly discussion with astronomer Fred Watson, and he frequently indulges his passion for mathematics on air. Linda Mottram Morning speaks with Dr. Carl one week and the other week with a range of cosmologists. James Valentine Afternoons has a weekly discussion with Bernie Hobbs from ABC Science. Richard Rava-Drave has a weekly session called Self-Improvement Wednesday, which regularly focuses on a science topic. Dominic Knight Evenings has a weekly discussion with Professor Fred Watson. Tony Delroy Nine Life includes a weekly segment News in Science, discussion with various freelance writers, and alternate weeks with Dr. Carr. In Melbourne, John Fane's mornings program often covers science topics, and the evenings has a regular segment on research, which frequently discusses medical research, very relevant in Melbourne. Brisbane, the breakfast program has a weekly segment with Peter Black about new technology, and Steve Austin Mornings has a weekly segment with Dr. Carl. In Newcastle, the morning programs has a weekly session on environmental topics. Afternoons has a weekly session called Science with Dr. Paul Willis, who's now at the Royal Institution of Australia, but formerly a Catalyst presenter. And the Drive program has a program on Show Us Your PhD, which often includes science PhD students. Adelaide Ian Henschke Mornings has a weekly discussion with Dr. Chris Daniels from the Centre for Urban Ecology and a fortnightly discussion on earth sciences, the geologist. Afternoons has a weekly segment with Dr. Paul Willis on contemporary issues in science. Ashley Walsh Weekends has a monthly discussion with an amateur astronomer. Perth Mornings has a weekly slot with Norman Swan. Afternoons has a weekly slot with Dr. Carl. 666 Canberra, with its proximity to the CSIRO, ANU has a science story virtually every day, I'm informed, and particularly in the afternoon session where the presenter has science qualifications. Then there are a series of specialist programs in areas of rural South Australia. Now, you will appreciate an irony in this list. It appears from my inquiries that the only capital city in which the ABC does not have a regular science segment is the city named after Charles Darwin, and there's something wrong with that. Our Catalyst, the ABC's flagship science program, began its 14th season of 26 half-hour shows, commenced in January and is continuing. It's not a stunt show, unlike many other television science programs. Most recent surveys, it has an average audience in metropolitan areas of 665,000 and 326,000 in regional areas. In 2012, the Catalyst website recorded 774,000 visitors and 123 streams of Catalyst segments off that website. ABC Television commissions a range of science documentaries and factual programs. The 2013 slate has a series such as Redesign My Brain and Kakadu. Over the last 2 financial years, 2011-12, 2012-13, the ABC commissioned 25 science-related programs for a total of 56 television hours. We spent $8.7 million on these programs, but as they were undertaken with the external industry, they were geared up to attract a further production investment of $18.1 million on top of the ABC's contribution. ABC Television also acquires documentaries from overseas. The well-known series from David Attenborough and others, and a number of others are in that category. Just as in radio, programs of general appeal also feature science stories. Landline, our principal regional and rural issues television program, I'm advised, has science-based stories in about a third of its programming. ABC 3 broadcasts at a children's television station, broadcasts science content to older children. It's broadcast 3 series since it was established in December 2009, live-action science program Backyard Science, and 1 series each of the Australian science-based game shows, Steampunks and Lab Rats, and also broadcast 2 series of UK science-based game shows. ABC for Kids, aimed at younger children, broadcast Octonauts, an animated series exploring the undersea environment. It's one of our most highly viewed programs on iView, with 348,000 plays in May of 2013. We call iView a catch-up service. For young children, it's the real thing. It's what they watch. They want to watch when they want to watch, not when some television programmer thinks it's a good time to watch. Online, now a few months ago, on a pleasingly bipartisan basis, the Commonwealth Parliament passed legislation adding for the first time the provision of digital media services to the ABC's traditional broadcasting role, validating what the ABC had done because it had been in the forefront of expansion into online and mobile platforms. For science communication, as for other spheres of discourse, this is where our most innovative and, in my opinion, most important future development lies. The ABC Science website is our flagship online science portal, containing both original material prepared only for the site, as well as aggregating all science-related material across the ABC. That's both radio and television. The site includes demonstrations and explanations of a wide variety of simple science experiments conducted by the, quote, surfing scientist, unquote, accompanied by lessons plans for teachers, Original content streams prepared for this site include News in Science, Great Moments in Science with Dr. Karl, Science Basics with Bernie Hobbs. In 2012, the site attracted 780,000 visits per month. It also has a broad international audience, reflecting the global appeal of its science content. In the 12 months to March 2013, 60% of our visits were from overseas. Then there's the Health and Wellbeing site, with 364,000 visits in 2012. The Technology and Game site, basically for a younger audience, attracted 117,000 visits a month. The Environment website aggregates environmental stories from across the ABC. It attracted 81,000 visits per month in 2012. On education, ABC One broadcasts a daily schools TV slot of expressly educational programs. I know this is not exactly entrancing, but I do want to get you a feel for the whole contribution. On Monday mornings, this features short science programs every Monday of the school year anyway, including Backyard Science, Atoms Alive, Inside Science, iMaths, Atoms on Fire and Science Class. Inside Science is new this year, the others are repeats. Schools TV also broadcasts 3 age-targeted mathematical shows, Countess In, Cyber Chase and Maths Shorts. On Tuesday mornings, Behind the News presents news stories. This is also directed at children, including science stories. We had recent, on the site you can see black holes, bionic eye, and new technology for tracking whales. The school's TV website contains not only information on the full range of ABC programs, but includes links to educational teacher resources to expand the functionality of these daily broadcasts, and those resources are available on most of the programs that I've mentioned. More significantly, just this year online, ABC Splash, the ABC's new education portal, which is directed to the new national curriculum, and with a specific grant from the Commonwealth for support for the new national curriculum, is developed in partnership with Education Services Australia, and its educational content is media-rich with interactive learning tools and supporting teacher resources. Give only one example. On 26 March, Splash launched what we call ABC Zoom Beta, an immersive game based on the concept of zooming in to see things at microscopic and atomic scales. The game is intended to allow students to intuitively explore scientific principles within physics, chemistry, and biochemistry. The ABC also produces original short-form science video for online access. Many of these programs are produced for online, but eventually broadcast, particularly on ABC2. Ace Day Jobs is developed as an inspirational approach to career guidance, including science careers. It was broadcast on ABC2. The DVD set, all 86 episodes, was distributed to all Australian high schools for free in 2009. Experimentals is a 28-episode series of 5-minute videos of simple science experiments, intending to be a contemporary equivalent of Julius Sumner Miller's classic program that I mentioned. It is available online and on DVD, was broadcast on ABC2. Then there was a series of 10 conversations with prominent scientists in a program called Talking Science, people like Dr. Jane Goodall, Tim Flannery, Peter Doherty, and others. There is an influential area of ABC programming which does not simply convey information, but which is capable of having significant impact on the scientific literacy of our community and its interest in science-related issues. And I refer to drama programming. I read with interest the report of the Science and Media Expert Working Group as part of the Inspiring Australia initiative, of which I'm sure everyone in this room is aware. That report made a range of significant recommendations to improve the communication of science, and they're worth following up. One of them derives from the experience in the United States of what they call the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which provides a forum for the science and entertainment communities to meet and to explore ways of getting more science and scientists into the media, including reality TV, drama and feature films. There can be no doubt about the force of drama and entertainment programming. I've experienced it in my previous job as a judge. Over recent years, a trend has emerged in which it appears that some juries are reluctant to convict the alleged criminals in the absence of some form of technical scientific evidence, such as DNA tests or even other sophisticated techniques. Criminal lawyers have come to refer to this reluctance as the CSI effect. There's no doubt that positive representation of scientists and scientific methods in crime dramas is one way of promoting an understanding of science. We do this in the British series Silent Witness, which we've been broadcasting for some years. But more recently, in Australia, the Dr. Blake Mysteries series, soon to be followed by a second series, was a sort of CSI for 1950s technology. Not as sophisticated, but the fact is the contrast itself says so much about scientific progress over the last half century. It does no harm to portray the scientist as hero, which these sorts of programs do. And no doubt it would be desirable, as the expert working group suggested, to have more such programming. I'll just get some water. I turn to news and current affairs. It's difficult to set out in comprehensive detail the coverage of science, medical and technological stories on the ABC's extensive news and current affairs programming. You're probably all aware of the range, not only daily news bulletins on radio and television, and the constant stream of news programming on ABC News 24. These regularly feature science-related programmings, as do programs such as AM, PM, World Today, Background Briefing on radio, Four Corners, 7:30 Report, and Australian Story on television, cover the full range of issues facing the Australian community. At a rough guess, it's been suggested to me that perhaps 10% of these programs have some kind of scientific element. That's probably as good a guess as any. The Catalyst team also produces, in addition to its principal program, short 2 to 3 minute science stories for general use across the ABC, not just online. For example, ABC News 24 broadcast these short extracts interstitially as under the title Catalyst Bites. That's with B-I-T-E-S. There are 3 dedicated science reporters in ABC News. For some time, there's been a national environmental science reporter and a national medical reporter. The recent increase in funds made available for ABC News and current affairs programming meant that a few months ago we added to those 2 a 3rd specialist science and technology reporter. Depending on the source of a particular story, of course, any journalist can be called upon to report it. ABC journalists are well aware of the resources available from the Science Media Centre, and as I understand it, frequently call upon its excellent service, using its emails and making contact for specific referrals. I believe it's true that in its news and current affairs programming, the ABC gives comparatively greater coverage to science-related issues, particularly, but not only, environmental and health-related issues. That is manifest in the content and structure of the general ABC News website, which is increasingly the principal point of contact with our online and mobile audience. That website contains links to each of our content-rich specialist science-related websites, which aggregate content across all ABC platforms, together with a considerable body of specialist materials and further links. I don't wish to suggest that all our journalists have a high standard of scientific literacy. Australia's education system does not deliver such talent across the board. Journalists do not differ from other educated Australians in terms of their scientific literacy. Developing those skills is and will remain an ongoing process. However, what I believe needs most work is to develop our capacity to appropriately challenge scientists, not least those whose work is distributed by press release from organisations with a vested interest in favourable publicity. That includes these days not only corporations, not only government departments, but also universities. Now, it's primarily for that reason that I would hope we can further develop the scientific literacy of our news and current affairs staff. In this, as in other areas, we must go beyond PR handouts or what has been called journalism. I want to turn to the subject of accuracy and impartiality. One of the express statutory duties of the Board of Directors of the ABC is, and I quote, to ensure that the gathering and presentation of news and information is accurate and impartial according to the recognised standards of objective journalism. That's a quote from the statute. This critical function, by reason of its express provision, is not a matter on which the board simply supervises ABC management. This is a matter upon which the board is required by law to be proactive. The qualification, according to the recognised standards of objective journalism, indicates that the standard is not the same as would be applicable in science. ABC has adopted a comprehensive set of editorial policies and a series of guidance notes formulating standards and elaborating on their application in various contexts. Whilst acknowledging that questions of impartiality often involve personal and subjective views, the ABC policies assert that it is our obligation to apply the impartiality standard as objectively as possible. In doing so, ABC staff are guided by certain hallmarks of impartiality as follows: a balance that follows the weight of the evidence, fair treatment, open-mindedness and opportunities over time for principal relevant perspectives on matters of contention to be expressed. The policies go on to emphasise that impartiality does not require that every perspective receives equal time, nor that every facet of every argument is presented. Further guidance is given as to a range of relevant factors that should be taken into account in making these judgments, despite the inherent subjectivity of some aspects of the process. All four of those hallmarks that I've mentioned are relevant to reporting on science, health and environment issues. I wish to emphasise the first, the principle that balance or impartiality must follow the weight of the evidence. Not all opinions or indeed controversies over fact are entitled to equal weight or equal time. Some may call this groupthink, and have. Well, there are matters on which some opinions fall outside any conception of reasonable debate, matters such as genocide or torture. There are also scientific issues which fall into or approach a "the earth is flat" proposition. For example, doubts about the health effects of tobacco or asbestos. The recognised standards of objective journalism do not require balance or impartiality in such contexts. The issue about which allegations of a lack of balance is most frequently made in current debate is that of climate change. So I understand the position. The difference between the principal parties is not about whether or not climate change is real and is aggravated by human activity, but rather as to what policies should be adopted. I am not a sceptic on this issue. Nevertheless, it is an inappropriate point in the electoral cycle for me to get involved in that debate. There's a somewhat less heated example of the dangers of not following the weight of the evidence on a scientific issue. In a number of nations, it is well documented that the media has played a pernicious role in purveying scare stories about the effects of vaccination. During the 1990s, there was a panic in France about the alleged effect of the hepatitis B vaccine on multiple sclerosis. Virtually no one outside France heard of this. In the United States, there was a scare about a preservative in some vaccines called thiomersal as a cause of autism. Again, this was hardly noticed anywhere outside the United States. In the Muslim world, notably in Nigeria and Pakistan, a deadly scare has involved allegations that the polio vaccination is a CIA plot to make Muslims sterile, leading to the assassination of a number of vaccine workers. In the United Kingdom, and to an extent in Australia, there's been an outbreak of concern about an alleged connection between measles, mumps and rubella, MMR vaccine, and autism. Many sections of the media love a scare story, and accordingly gave a small 1998 study by a maverick scientist entirely unwarranted publicity probably because it was alarming and therefore a good story. This continued from time to time, irrespective of the overwhelming body of scientific studies which disproved, indeed discredited, that research. It continued even after the study was withdrawn by the magazine that published it, and even after the author of the study was accused of fraud and struck off the medical register. Yet as recently as April of this year, I saw, when I was in London, a reputable British newspaper, The Independent, repeat these alleged findings. It did so when reporting a measles epidemic in Wales, which was almost certainly caused by the decreased vaccination rates in England. England is now the second lowest rate in Europe. It only beats Romania in terms of vaccination rates. And that followed clearly the earlier media reporting. A report on the quality and impartiality of BBC science reporting a year and a bit ago indicated that the very fact that the BBC had given equal time to these both arguments in its initial reporting of the story of this research, the very fact that the BBC had done that, was interpreted by many as an indication that the anti-vaccination case had some real basis. It's bad enough that the internet and the power of search engines make junk science universally available, particularly via Dr. Google, without the public broadcasters making the position worse. The significant level of trust which the BBC, like the ABC, enjoys was, in this case, part of the problem. On this occasion, equal time was not balance, it was ignorance. As a leading British science journalist put it, by making a fetish of balance and insisting too rigidly that both sides of a story are told, it becomes very easy to mislead. As manifest by the recent legislation in New South Wales requiring parents who wish to place their children in childcare centres to produce proof of vaccination, this is a public health issue. When a sufficiently large proportion of the population is immunised against a contagious disease, which varies from one disease to another, the proportion does, immunised individuals are effectively, unimmunised individuals are effectively protected from it by the relative inability of the disease to spread through the population. Only vaccination provides this herd immunity. Excuse me, I'm just making some running repairs here. Thank you. The issue became directly relevant to the ABC when Catalyst broadcast a story on vaccination in May 2012. The program attracted quite a number of complaints from anti-vaccination individuals. These complaints were dismissed, and properly so. Balance is not required when children's health, indeed children's lives, are at risk by ventilating extreme scientific opinion. Whether that is done in the interest of media impact or to protect oneself from allegations of partiality. Where the weight of the evidence is clear, the ABC is entitled to act on that basis. Not to do so is irresponsible journalism. There are, of course, always difficulties in knowing where to draw the line on issues of public controversy. The BBC report on impartiality drew a useful distinction between dealing with skeptics who are willing to engage in debate on the evidence and denialists who, and I quote, see themselves as intellectual martyrs in a war against political correctness. The report went on to describe the syndrome in the following way, which I think is quite eloquent, and many of you will recognise some of the people to whom they would refer in the Australian context. The report said this: the tale is told of a vast conspiracy to hide the truth and of dissent quashed by secret forces. People with strong opinions should be given equal weight with experts. Any evidence that contradicts their ideas must be publicised and the rest ignored, while any statement of doubt must be trumpeted from the rooftops. Standards of proof should be set so high as to be impossible to attain. Personal attacks, like Hitler was also against smoking, are acceptable, and absolutism is useful. One 90-year-old smoker proves that tobacco is harmless. Doubt shades into certainty, as science can never say that a vaccine is always safe, which means that it never is. I do not expect that allegations of a lack of balance on the part of the ABC will ever go away. Sometimes the criticisms are justified. However, there is always someone with an interest to make allegations or run campaigns. I'm pleased to say that such allegations happen quite rarely for our science-related programs, perhaps other than on climate change. And particularly so, that is so, when one takes into account the scope and range of our reporting on scientific matters, which I've outlined a few moments ago. I am aware that the Academy has expressed views on the scope and extent of our science coverage, and I wish to assure you that we do wish to tap into your expertise to ensure that we are addressing the important issues in specialist subject areas. The ABC has a charter obligation to deliver specialist content, and in undertaking this task, we intend to seek guidance from experts in such specialist fields in a structured way to ensure that our focus is right, that we understand the latest thinking and research, and that we are providing as valuable, as accurate, and as impartial a service as we can across all platforms. The ABC Board has decided that science is a well-established and comprehensive specialist area operating across all ABC platforms should be the first area in which this policy is implemented. The ABC will begin consultations with peak science organisations, including the Academy, to establish a reference panel with expertise in scientific research, science education and science communication. Professor Fiona Stanley, who's Director of the ABC, will chair this reference panel, but she'll be the only ABC Director on the panel. This science panel is the first quality reference panel established to give advice to the ABC and will, if successful, serve as a model for other program areas. This panel will not be a standing advisory council. Instead, it will perform a number of specific tasks set out in terms of reference. The panel will be asked to have regard in carrying out its terms of reference to the duties and functions of the ABC, including our duty to ensure that our gathering and presentation of news and information is accurate and impartial according to the recognised standards of objective journalism, as I've quoted. First, the panel will be asked to develop a set of indicators, the hallmarks of quality science content, against which the ABC can evaluate science content delivered across its platforms. Secondly, the panel will provide the ABC with advice on the breadth and depth of its coverage. The members of the panel will be asked to agree to a list of the top 10 most significant science stories in the last 12 months. Thirdly, the ABC will catalogue its coverage of these issues across all platforms and report back to the reference panel. Fourthly, the panel will be asked to consider that report. Fifthly, a symposium will be held following the production of the report to allow discussion between panel members and ABC content makers and editors. That symposium will not be limited to matters discussed in the report, but will facilitate a broad dialogue on the coverage of science. Finally, the ABC will publicly report on the results of the consultation. In addition to the reference panel process, the ABC will also commission research to determine whether it effectively communicates complex science content. Specific pieces of ABC science content will be put before audiences and surveys conducted to determine whether the content increased understanding, engaged audiences, and encouraged them to want to find out more. I look forward to the outcome of this new level of collaboration between the ABC and the Academy and the broader scientific community. In conclusion, let me say that I'm sure that you are all acutely aware of the disparity of knowledge, engagement and enthusiasm on the part of the Australian public between our contribution to world science on the one hand and our contribution to world sport on the other. However, in terms of the power of conveying information and on many occasions of persuasion, one of the most significant contributions Australians have made on the world stage is in the form of the tabloid headline. This is primarily because of the expansion of News Limited overseas and taking Australian sub-editors all over the world. It's not only that, but that's the main source. Australian sub-editors have made a disproportionate contribution to the punch of tabloid newspapers, particularly in London and New York. Let me, in conclusion, share with you my favourite set of newspaper headlines. These appeared in Le Moniteur Universel, the principal French newspaper during the French Revolution and for some years thereafter. It was virtually the official journal of the French government of the day, including during and after Napoleon's rule. Throughout the 100 days, the 100 jours, between Napoleon's escape from Elba and the restoration of the Bourbons after Waterloo, Le Moniteur remained loyal to the government. On the day of his escape, Le Moniteur led with the following headline: "The cannibal has left his lair." Thereafter, there appeared the following sequence of headlines. "The Corsican ogre has just landed at the Juan Gulf." "The tiger has arrived at Gap." "The monster slept at Grenoble." "The tyrant has crossed Lyon." "The usurper was seen 60 leagues from the capital." Then there's a slight change of tone. "Bonaparte has advanced with great strides, but he will never enter Paris." And then, "Tomorrow Napoleon will be under our ramparts." And then another change. "The emperor has arrived at Fontainebleau." And finally, "His Imperial Royal Majesty entered his palace of the Tuileries last night in the midst of his faithful subjects." The ability to adapt to changing circumstances is an important life skill for scientists as well as broadcasters, and Le Moniteur is an example to us all. Thank you. Do we have time to...
Willing to engage in some questions. Excellent. Before we wrap up the evening, I'm sure there are so many questions out there. Certainly there's a mixture of scientists and science reporters and communicators here. So we've got microphones, and if you'll put up your hand, I'll try and see you in order. And but I think it's really important if you just quickly say who you are and where you come from or what you do, just to give an inkling as to whether you're a scientist or a communicator or what. So, who's going to be first? Oh, you've dazed them. Is there one over here? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thomas McCoy, freelance science writer. Jim, you were talking about sort of the, almost like the dying industry of science journalism or declining industry. Any feeling for why that is and what can be done about it?
Well, the business model of print is basically broken, as we've seen. So it's not just science journalism that's tending to get less space, but other kinds of specialist journalism in print. Now, broadcast is not as bad, but it's also challenged because it's also losing audiences, particularly young audiences. Obviously, there's an awful lot that's going on online, but it's not the same kind of mechanisms, and it doesn't... It involves an awful lot of freelance work, in which you may very well be engaged yourself, that doesn't have the same, if you like, capacity to develop a reputation. This may change over time. There will be sites that develop a new business model. Some of them may find some specialisation in science and technology issues. However, to be quite frank, the transition process is absolutely unpredictable. I mean, I have no idea who in 10 years' time, assuming the ABC survives in its present form, that will be the ABC's main competition. I suspect on television it might be YouTube, and in radio it might be iTunes, but I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, actually. The development of technology and of forms of communication are now so rapid, and I mean, the iPad is 2.5 years old. Think of that. 2.5 years ago, we didn't have tablets. I mean, I have no idea where it's going.
Yes, another question up in the middle, please.
Hello, my name is Neeraj Lal from the ANU, a scientist. Thanks very much for your talk. It seems that, with an exception of perhaps of Dr. Carl, in the ABC and in the media more generally, there's a focus on presenting cutting-edge science, so that's knowledge at the forefront of human knowledge. But there seems that there's a general sense that the level of scientific literacy in the community is at a much different level, with little knowledge about how science works or the scientific method or how vaccines work or tides or rainbows or basic science at this kind of level. And I could imagine there's perhaps parallels in the political and legal spheres also. So I noticed in none of the four remits that the ABC had was the word education mentioned. And I was wondering, so the question is, what do you see as the role and appropriate channels for the ABC in providing simple scientific knowledge that isn't at the forefront of scientific research?
I outlined what we do on science education. It's probably an area of the ABC's conduct that hasn't received the priority in recent years that it did in, say, a couple of decades ago. It's back now because of our capacity to produce this online. Yes, there's, school hours, there are programs of a particular character directed at school audiences. But it's the online space where we've expanded quite recently with a special grant that expires in a year or two, or 18 months. But as I understand it, I haven't used it, but there's some response from a lot of teachers already that what the new Splash site, which is directed to the new national curriculum, is really quite successful and being used. I agree with you that that's an area that we could develop and allocate more resources to, but I suspect it's going to be more online than any other form, because that's the way a lot of these communications are most effectively directed. Rather than using a television or even a radio spectrum bandwidth. I don't want to say who listens to the radio where, but education doesn't happen when you're driving around in a car, for example, which a lot of radio listening is. And I think our online contribution is where the expansion in that field will lie.
I think there's a question up the back. Is it Anne-Marie? Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. My name's Anna Maria Arabia from Questacon, the National Science and Technology Centre. An often used phrase is thank God for the ABC, and I think that's worth repeating tonight, having heard your impressive list of programs that contain science content. And congratulations on the desire to establish the panel you described. Yet we know over time that budgetary difficulties or indeed other issues have led to the loss of things like long-form in-house capability in Australia for long-form documentaries and things of the sort. Is there a way to further cement science content? And I'm very keen to hear your views on including science formally in the ABC Charter.
Which we wrote to you about.
Well, you can, but we'd do it anyway. I mean, it comes within our general remit to have science, to have programming directed to either educational functions or to specialist audiences. We do have that, and science is clearly answer is relevant in both those. So it's in the Charter, although not by that name. Look, the in-house versus outhouse, if I can call it that, production technique is an issue without a single correct answer. Yes, there are some advantages in producing things in-house in terms of developing a group, and that's what we've done with Catalyst and obviously with the science unit and its contribution in the various radio programs I mentioned. However, what we can't do is gear up in the documentary and factual space. There are sources of funding that are available if we have external producers produce science documentaries and other documentaries for us. It more than doubles the resources we have available. That includes money from other government sources, like Screen Australia, which subsidises documentaries, couldn't just give the ABC money. Its funding is available only if there are external producers. These sorts of, basically, we can spend more than double what we actually allocate ourselves if we go that route, and I can't see that changing in the near future.
Thank you. I think Catriona was next.
From Science and Technology Australia. Thank you very much, Justice Spigelman, for, I thought the list was terrific because we do forget how much the ABC does. You've made some very accurate comments about the revolution that is affecting print media, but also having effects on broadcast. I'm wondering what you think the most substantial challenge is for the ABC with the advent of the 24/7 news cycle. I think factual accuracy has to be affected despite the adherence and the commitment the ABC has to getting the facts right. I'm interested in your view.
I'm not quite sure. You asked what the biggest challenge was, and then you talked about factual accuracy. Well, that is, I mean, there's a technological challenge, and I accept that factual accuracy is at the core of what we have to do, and it's vital. I mean, our entire reputation is based on that. And as we've seen with the recent hits that the BBC has taken to its reputation, it's something that you can build up over a long time, and you can seriously destroy it in an eye blink. And the BBC unquestionably is not regarded in the same way as it was even a year or two ago, by reason of a number of things, including getting things just wrong. But we haven't had anything like that, but it's an accident that can happen to anyone. I'm not quite sure what more can be done other than to maintain the professionalism of our staff. We've had a one-off quite substantial expansion by reason of the government agreeing to us extending our news and current affairs team. I mean, there are going to be something like 35 or 40 more journalists employed by the ABC just in the space of a few months, including, as I say, extending an additional specialist science reporter on the ABC News. So one hopes that this new intake will be of a high quality. Many of them, as I understand it, are not people who come from journalism, but come from other spheres, including various backgrounds of an educational character. And it's one of those things that I hope that a very substantial number of them are younger, because the ABC does have an issue about its demographic structure. The main problem being that once someone gets employed at the ABC, they don't want to leave. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, it's just a fact of life that if that happens for long enough, your average age goes up. So having a new infusion allows us to change that. In particular, one of the things that happened when we created News 24, which became a much younger staff for that, and it's changed completely. It had a huge impact on other and older journalists, because they see these, what they would regard as kids in their 20s or late 20s or mid-20s to maybe early 30s at the outset, sitting there and doing a story, and they're sitting at the same table, and they cut and paste various things. They do their own editing, they bring in some visuals and bring in their own music and edit the whole thing and then send it off. And these, these older guys look around and say, you did all that yourself? You didn't have a sound editor? You didn't have an editor of any kind? You didn't, but they are actually having an impact on the whole organisation. I mean, 5 or 6 years ago, there used to be 14 people in a television studio, like the 7 o'clock news. There are now 4 in those studios around the country, and that's all done with technology. So, and the fact that that's acceptable is being impacted by an influx of younger people who are just more used to this, dealing with this technology. I hope that continues.
I think we have room for only one more question. I think at the back there was the one who's been waiting the longest. And yes, sorry.
My name's Julie Preston. I work with early career academics at ANU on a Nectar program. I'm interested, from the point of view of the researchers, how we can be involved in actually participating in the ABC's efforts in sharing science with the public, beyond just press releases on the work that we're doing in the lab.
Behind what? I'm sorry.
Beyond press releases
I
from the
see.
lab.
I see.
I guess she's volunteering to be part of this new, quality science reference panel. Should have some young people on it.
Well, it may be, that may be, but or even some older people, perhaps. Yes.
Perhaps.
Yes, that's right. I don't know the answer to that question, because what happens in all of these things is that the producers and the presenters of these programs have their own range of contacts. And what I suggest you do is to pick a program and go and meet the people who run it. There's no point in asking me.
So with that, reluctantly, very reluctantly, because I can see more and more hands creeping up, we must close. Mr. Spigelman, it's been a feast. I think that you've sensed here an audience that very, very highly values the ABC, and therefore we very much appreciate you coming here and talking to us and being able to discuss ABC science shows with you. I think the challenge between scientists and journalists is always that scientists hate taking shortcuts. We always want to qualify, and really educating in science actually requires longer than the short bites that are typically more and more a feature of modern communication. So I very much hope that the Academy and the ABC can continue to work together to enhance the quality of science literacy in this country, because like you, I believe that's critical for the future prosperity of this country. We have had on the whole, great experiences with the ABC, our immunisation questions and answers booklets, and the appropriate coverage that the ABC gave that is just one example. So I guess I'm volunteering my entire academy and putting it to the ABC's disposal. We would very much like to work with the ABC more energetically and vigorously. One of our major platforms is science literacy in the public, and you have so much access to the public. We would like to help you in that goal. So without more ado, can you join with me in thanking Justice Spigelman for coming here tonight and sharing the vast range of contributions that the ABC makes to science, and wish him well in his position, in this very, very important position, chairing the board of the ABC. Thank you very much.